Hey there, everybody. Welcome to episode 13 of Tell Me a True Crime Story. I'm your host, Holly. Thank you guys so much for being here with me today. I hope that you and your family are happy, healthy, and safe. And I truly hope that you guys enjoyed the holiday season and got to take some time off and spend it with those that you love and care about. In episode 12, the last episode, Abducted from a Payphone, I brought you the heartbreaking story and the enduring mystery of the abduction of Angie Hammond from Missouri. Angie was pregnant and talking to her fiancé from a payphone when she was kidnapped. Ironically, the kidnapping of Angie Hammond from our last episode happened just a few weeks after the murder that we're going to talk about in this episode. This case I'm going to tell you about today has stuck with me through the years ever since I first heard it. I know I say that in almost every episode, but it's so true. There are just those ones that forever haunt me and stick out in my mind. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends and family about it. Follow the podcast on social media. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are at Tell Me a True Crime Story, and Twitter is at Tell Me a TCS Pod. Also, please check out my other podcast, All Available Units Respond. So far, there are 4 episodes on there. Thank you so much again for being here, and big hugs to all of you. Now, let me tell you a true crime story. First, let's get a feel for the area where these events occur. Our story today takes place in March of 1991 in 2 separate locations. It starts out in Columbus, Ohio, in Franklin County, more specifically the Wineland Park area of Columbus, Ohio. Wineland Park is about 2 miles north of downtown Columbus and is near Ohio State University. The Wineland Park neighborhood is 30 square blocks and has a population of approximately 4,800 people. As far as crime rates in the area around the time that our story takes place in 1991, according to winelandpark.org, quote, by the 1990s, Wineland Park had the highest violent crime rate in the city, end quote. The other location where our story occurs is in a rural farming community in West Jefferson, Ohio, in Madison County. And this is about a 30-minute drive west of the city of Columbus, Ohio. Jessica Lyn Keen was born on Wednesday, September 24th, 1975, to Rebecca and James. Jessica attended Oakview Elementary in Kettering, Ohio, where she was in the gifted program in 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. The then coordinator of gifted education in Kettering, Tom Tudor, said that Jessica was in the upper 3% of all students at her grade level in the district, and that her IQ was in the mid-130s. Jessica's grandfather said she loved animals and wanted to major in veterinary medicine. Her mom said Jessica had many plans, hopes, and dreams. One of them was that she wanted to be a zoologist. Friends said Jessica was always laughing, smiling, and singing. Jessica attended Kettering Junior High School before she moved to Columbus. In 1988, when she was 13 years old, she and her mom moved to Columbus to be closer to her maternal grandparents. Columbus was about an hour and 15 minutes drive northeast from Kettering. In Columbus, Jessica attended Westland High School. In her freshman year, she was an honor roll student and on the cheerleading squad. When she was a sophomore, she met Shawn Thompson, who was a senior and on the football team. They soon started to date, and Jessica quickly became all consumed with Shawn. She started skipping school to spend time with him, and she lost interest in cheerleading and her studies. Shawn got in trouble for being habitually truant from school and eventually stopped attending school altogether. Then one day, Jessica's mom, Rebecca, got a call from Jessica's school principal. The principal told Rebecca that Jessica had been skipping school, her grades had dropped, and she'd quit cheerleading. Rebecca was unaware that Jessica had quit the cheer team. Rebecca felt that Shawn was too old for Jessica and that he was a bad influence on her. Therefore, she forbade Jessica from seeing Shawn anymore. Mother and daughter had many arguments over this, and tensions steadily grew between them. Rebecca asked the high school counselor if they could recommend anything to help this situation. The counselor referred them for counseling sessions at the Huckleberry House, a nearby safe house and crisis center for runaway and troubled teens. Jessica was checked in for a short stay at Huckleberry House on March 4th, 1991. She continued attending school at Westland High School while at Huckleberry House and got to and from school by using the city bus lines. With help from the counselors at Huckleberry House, Jessica and her mom began to work on rebuilding their relationship. By Friday, March 15th, 1991, Jessica had been staying at Huckleberry House for about 2 weeks, and she was supposed to go home the very next day when she went missing. On the afternoon of Friday, March 15th, Jessica had attended a group therapy session at 4:30 p.m., then afterward called her boyfriend Shawn from Huckleberry House. They got into an argument about the status of their relationship. When Jessica got off the phone with Shawn, she asked her friend to go to the Westland Mall with her, which was about 10 miles away. She wanted to try to meet up with Shawn at the mall. She figured he might be there since it was a regular teen hangout. Jessica's friend said she could not go with her, so Jessica set out by herself. Between 6 p.m. and 6:30 p.m., Jessica's friend saw her standing at the bus stop at 8th Avenue and Summit Street, which was across the street from the Huckleberry House. That would be the last time any of Jessica Keen's friends or family would ever see her again. It turns out that while waiting at the bus stop, a car pulled up and the driver offered Jessica a ride. She told the man she was waiting for the bus. But by now it was dark out, and Jessica's only worry was trying to find Shawn, so she accepted the stranger's offer of a ride. However, the man did not take her to the mall. He took her instead to a remote, rural area in the next county to the west. He put duct tape over her mouth and raped her several times. But Jessica was feisty. She had an athletic build and she fought back. At some point, she got away from her captor. She jumped out of his car naked and ran for her life. The man left the car running, got out, and gave chase after her. Jessica ran like hell, ran as fast as she could. She didn't realize it at first, but she'd run into a graveyard. Foster Chapel Cemetery was roughly 200 years old at the time our story takes place. Some headstones date back to the late 1700s. At approximately 9 p.m., a man on his way home from work got off of I-70 and proceeded north on Plain City, Georgesville Road. Just south of Foster Chapel Cemetery, he came upon an abandoned car that was left running in the middle of the road. It had its headlights turned off. He got out to investigate. He didn't see a driver in the car. He didn't hear anything. Unfortunately and very sadly, where the car was left in the roadway was too far away from the cemetery for this man to have been able to hear Jessica's desperate screams for help. The man got back in his car. He then saw a black man running from the direction of the cemetery and getting back into the running car. The witness thought the situation was strange, but didn't think much else of it, and he left. As I said, Foster Chapel Cemetery is in a very isolated area. It's surrounded by acres and acres of farmland in all directions. Jessica knelt down behind headstones, desperately trying to hide from her kidnapper. She could see lights from a farmhouse off in the distance behind the cemetery. This house was at least 1/4 of a mile away. Jessica came out of her hiding spot behind a large headstone and started running toward that house, toward the only visible possible safe haven, that farmhouse. One of her socks came off as she ran, while running full speed in the pitch black darkness toward the lights of the farmhouse. Jessica slammed into a fence post at the back of the cemetery. The impact knocked her to the ground. Her captor caught up with her then. He went for a weapon of opportunity. He pulled from the ground a huge 70-pound headstone that was about 20 inches wide by 30 inches tall. He brought it down onto Jessica's head. He hit her in the head with it several times. The headstone broke in half. He threw both pieces of the headstone over the fence. As he fled the area, he got rid of evidence, discarding Jessica's clothes and tennis shoes by throwing them out of his car window. Meanwhile, counselors at Huckleberry House called Jessica's mom, Rebecca, to tell her that Jessica had missed the 11 p.m. curfew. Her mom was worried, but thought she was with her boyfriend, Shawn Thompson. Rebecca tried calling Shawn, but she couldn't reach him. Just after midnight, she filed a missing persons report with the Columbus Police Department. She continued to call around to see if anyone had seen or heard from Jessica. Then Rebecca finally heard from Shawn. He called her and said that Jessica was not with him and he did not know where she was. The next morning, Saturday, March 16, 1991, a man found a pair of blue jeans on the berm of the eastbound ramp to I-70 coming from Plain City, Georgesville Road. In the pocket of the jeans were COTA bus tickets. COTA stands for Central Ohio Transit Authority, the bus line that Jessica used while staying at the Huckleberry House. The jeans were turned over to the Madison County Sheriff's Office. About an hour later, another man found a pair of black and white Nike tennis shoes on Plain City, Georgesville Road, just north of Foster Chapel Cemetery. They were also turned over to the Madison County Sheriff's Office. The next day, a little bit after 12 noon, on Sunday, March 17, 1991, a young photographer named Amy went to Foster Chapel Cemetery to explore and take pictures of the pioneer-era gravestones. She discovered the body of a young white female in the back corner of the cemetery. She left immediately to go make a call to the police. Detectives from the Madison County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. The body at the back of the cemetery by the fence was nude, except for one muddy sock on her right foot, and her bra, which had been pulled up and twisted around her neck. She was lying on her back. Her left leg was bent at the knee and her right leg was straight. Her arms were bent at the elbows and both hands were up near her head. Her face and upper chest were covered with dried blood. There were faint markings on her wrists. At the front of the cemetery, footprints were found in the mud beside the roadway and through a ditch. Following the direction of the footprints, investigators found a mud mark on the front fence of the cemetery. A short distance inside the front of the cemetery, there was a piece of duct tape on the ground with a big clump of human hair in it. Perhaps the girl had ripped off the duct tape to scream for help, or maybe even to be able to breathe better since she was in a race for her life. A little further in, the girl's other sock was found. This sock matched the sock that remained on the girl's body. Both socks had yellow paint chips on the bottom of them, which suggested to detectives that the paint was most likely from the yellow striping on the road. They surmised the girl had been running on the roadway before she went into the cemetery. Still further into the cemetery, in the soft ground, there were knee and elbow impressions behind a headstone. Also, that headstone had been knocked askew. The young girl's knee bore an injury which was consistent with having banged it into that headstone. The trail of evidence painted a clear picture for detectives that the girl had escaped her kidnapper. She ran naked in the cold. It was in the low 30s that night. She was terrified as she first ran along the roadway, then through the ditch to the white painted fence. She climbed over the wooden fence and fled into the cemetery. She knelt down behind a headstone, attempting to hide from the man who was in pursuit of her. Ultimately, she'd run in total darkness to the back southeast corner of the cemetery, where she collided with the fence post and fell to the ground. This surely stunned her and maybe even knocked her unconscious. Then the perpetrator killed her right there. A strand of her hair was found on that fence post. Near her body, on the other side of that fence, were both halves of the broken gravestone that Jessica had been bludgeoned with. The top half of the gravestone had the last name Henry on it. Both the top half and the bottom half of the gravestone had visible bloodstains on them. An autopsy on the girl's body was performed on Monday, March 18, 1991, by then-Deputy Franklin County Coroner Dr. Patrick Fardall. He performed a rape test kit which revealed sperm on her vaginal swab. A DNA profile was generated from the sperm. Dr. Fardall found numerous abrasions and lacerations to the girl's head, neck, and body. She had contusions, bleeding around her brain, a fractured mandible, which is the jawbone, hemorrhaging of her cervical vertebra, and she'd aspirated blood. Her cause of death was determined to be blunt force impact to the head. The first crucial step in the detectives' investigation was to identify the victim. They had to find out who she was. Of course, since she'd been found naked, there was no identification on her. The news reported the finding of the girl's body in the cemetery. Jessica's mom, Rebecca, received a phone call from a friend who was aware that Jessica was missing and asked Rebecca if she'd seen the news. Rebecca said that she hadn't. Her friend informed her that a young woman's body had been found in a cemetery. Rebecca called the authorities in neighboring Madison County, the county in which the cemetery was located, to see if it was her daughter, Jessica. Investigators from the Madison County Sheriff's Office visited Rebecca's home to show her pictures from the crime scene at Foster Chapel Cemetery. Rebecca said that the girl in the pictures looked like her daughter, but it was not her. But it was her Jessica. Investigators looked at a photo of Jessica hanging on the wall, and they were pretty sure the body that had been found was Jessica's. Rebecca was understandably just a mother in denial. Investigators asked Rebecca and Shawn, Jessica's boyfriend, to go to the morgue to see if they could positively identify the body in person. However, while at the morgue, just before they entered the room where the body was, investigators stopped Rebecca from going in. They thought that the sight of her daughter would be too much for her. Shawn went in alone and positively identified the body as Jessica's. Rebecca was still in denial that it was Jessica until she learned of a telltale scar on the finger of the girl's body. She now knew it was her Jessica. Detectives interviewed everyone at Huckleberry House in an attempt to build a timeline and see what information they might have. They learned that she was last seen at the bus stop on Friday evening. Since she'd argued with Shawn on the phone before her disappearance and left to meet up with him afterward, they first focused on Shawn as a possible suspect. Detectives learned that he was in a car with 5 friends headed to Florida. They put out an APB on the car Shawn and his friends were traveling south in. They eventually got stopped in Georgia and were brought back to Ohio for questioning. They all denied involvement in Jessica's murder. A DNA sample was obtained from Shawn and one of the guys he'd been headed to Florida with. Neither were a match for the DNA sample obtained during Jessica's autopsy. They were cleared as suspects. 5 years later, Madison County Sheriff's Office turned the case over to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Authorities with the Bureau started by investigating the other 4 guys that had been traveling to Florida with Jessica's boyfriend right after her murder. They all submitted a sample of their DNA for analysis and were given polygraphs. Their DNA did not match the DNA obtained during Jessica's autopsy, and all four passed their polygraph exams. They were also cleared as suspects in Jessica's murder. Over a decade passed, and investigators were getting desperate, but they continued to work the case. They re-examined evidence and re-interviewed witnesses. A reward offered in Jessica's case reached up to $100,000. But Special Agent Costas with the Bureau had one last idea. In the years since Jessica's murder, the FBI had launched CODIS, the National DNA Database. You see, prior to CODIS, DNA samples had to be compared to known suspects. There wasn't yet a database that contained genetic profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and detainees. Ohio BCI Special Agent Costas wanted to submit a sample obtained at Jessica's autopsy through CODIS. However, there was one major problem. The semen sample obtained at Jessica's autopsy had been used up during prior DNA testing against the previous suspects in the case. There was no more of the original sample left to run further testing on. Nevertheless, Agent Costas took the empty test tube to a forensic scientist at Ohio Bureau of Investigation's crime lab. The scientist swabbed the empty test tube and looked at it under a microscope, and he was able to see sperm cells. Miraculously, the sample was 17 years old and microscopic, but yielded a full genetic profile. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS and came back with a match within minutes. 17 years later to the day when Jessica's body was found, the Ohio Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab informed BCI Special Agent Costas of the DNA match. They finally identified Jessica's killer, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. In the 17 years since Jessica had been killed, his name had never come up in the investigation into her murder. Not much is known about Marvin Lee Smith Jr. He was born on Monday, November 19, 1956. He was 34 years old in 1991 when he killed Jessica. At the time of Jessica's murder, he was living in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, which is just south of the Huckleberry house where Jessica was staying. When authorities began looking into Marvin Lee Smith Jr., they discovered that he had a history of violence against women. His DNA had been taken and entered into CODIS when he was released from prison after serving time for rape and kidnapping. In one incident on February 4th, 1990, around 5:45 p.m., 29-year-old Shirley Hutchins was walking near Greenwich Street and Loretta Avenue in Columbus when a car pulled up next to her. The driver asked her for directions. She leaned down to give the man directions, and he asked her if she performed sexual pleasures. He said he had $10 he would give her. She said no, she did not, and started to walk away. The man then grabbed her coat and began pulling her in the car window toward him. She struggled to get away from him, and they fought. He hit her in the face, and she hit him back in the face. He jerked her purse off of her arm and threw it into his back seat. He shoved her, which knocked her to the ground. He then backed up his car, then raced forward towards her, trying to run her over. She was able to jump out of the way and got his license plate number as he sped off. She later identified Marvin Lee Smith Jr. in a photo array. He was arrested and charged with robbery. On July 16, 1990, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor theft. Later that same year, on December 7, 1990, at approximately 2:20 p.m., 20-year-old Melissa Bryant Lyles was waiting at a bus stop on Chittenden Avenue in Columbus when a man pulled up and asked her where she was going. She told him she was going to her brother's school. He asked her if she wanted a ride, and she said no. He then told her that her mom asked him to take her to the school. so she got into his car. He started driving, but not towards the school. He went in the opposite direction. The man repeatedly asked Melissa if she wanted to engage in sexual activity. She told him no. The man took her to his residence. She ran, but he caught her and took her inside his home. He removed her clothes but left her underwear on. Melissa tried again to escape, but the man caught her again and threw her onto the bed. He told her not to try to run away anymore and that he had a knife. He ordered her to take off her underwear and give him oral sex. He shoved her head down and put his penis in her mouth. Afterward, he raped her. She later identified Marvin Lee Smith Jr. in a photo array. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of rape and 1 count of kidnapping. He pleaded guilty to the charges. On August 27, 1991, he was sentenced to 3 to 15 years on each count. The sentences were to run concurrently to one another. Marvin Lee Smith Jr. attacked Shirley Hutchins about a year before Jessica's murder and raped Melissa Bryant Lyles about 3 months before Jessica's murder. The assaults on those 2 women were very similar to the MO used in Jessica's kidnapping and murder. All 3 young women were approached at a bus stop in the afternoon within a few miles of each other and within a few miles of Marvin Lee Smith Jr.'s residence. All were sexually motivated attacks. He coaxed Melissa Bryant Lyles by telling her that her mom wanted him to pick her up and take her to her brother's school. Similarly, he lied and told Jessica he would give her a ride to the mall. When Shirley Hutchins and Melissa Bryant Lyles rejected his sexual advances, he became infuriated. He tried to run over Shirley Hutchins with his car, and he threw Melissa Bryant Lyles on the bed and threatened her with a knife. Authorities believe that when Jessica escaped him during the sexual assault, he became enraged and killed her. At the time of the DNA match, in 2008, parole records showed that Marvin Lee Smith Jr. was living in North Carolina. Authorities went to North Carolina to talk to him about Jessica's murder. They showed him a picture of Jessica, and he claimed to have never seen her before. This was good news to authorities because if he'd claimed to have known her and had consensual sex with her, their DNA evidence against him would be worthless. They confronted him with the DNA evidence. The odds of the DNA from Jessica's rape kit belonging to someone other than him were 1 in quintillion. Just to put that number into perspective, 1 quintillion means that there would be a 1 followed by 18 zeros. On March 28, 2008, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. was arrested for the sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder of 15-year-old Jessica Lyn Keen. He was extradited back to Ohio to stand trial. Prosecutors intended to seek the death penalty against him. On February 27, 2009, in order to avoid a death sentence, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. waived his right to a jury trial and entered into a plea agreement. He was sentenced by a 3-judge panel that imposed a sentence of 30 years to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. He started serving his sentence on April 7, 2009. Marvin Lee Smith Jr. is incarcerated at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, which houses an inmate population of about 1,700. He is Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections inmate number A605036. In March of 2038, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. will have his first parole hearing, at which time he will be 81 years old. A memorial cross was erected in Foster Chapel Cemetery, where Jessica lost her life. On the cross is her name, and it says, "Killed here, March 17, 1991. Jessica was laid to rest at Sunset Cemetery in Galloway, Ohio, which is only 7.5 miles from the cemetery where she lost her life. If she were alive today in January of 2023, Jessica would be 47 years old. This heartbreaking story reminded me of what we talked about in episode 11, Nightmare in Knoxville. to never let anyone take you to a second location. When Jessica got into Marvin Lee Smith Jr.'s car, he took her 20 miles west of the city to a desolate area. If you are somewhere and someone tries to abduct you, fight them like your life depends on it, because it does. Do not let anyone get you in a vehicle to take you anywhere, because where they will take you will be isolated. They will have complete power and control over you and the situation. You likely will never make it out of there safely. Fight to stay wherever you are, even if they have a weapon. Fight and scream for help. Run away. Just do not let them take you to somewhere of their choosing. Thank you so much, guys, for listening to this episode of Tell Me a True Crime Story. Please subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends and family members about it. Share the podcast or share an episode that you loved. Follow the podcast on social media. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are at Tell Me a True Crime Story, and Twitter is at Tell Me a TCS Pod. I would love it if you would please write a review for the podcast and give it 5 stars. That would help me so much to grow our podcast family. Also, please check out my other podcast, All Available Units Respond. The podcast covers interesting stories in detail of disasters and catastrophes like structural collapses, massive fires, train derailments, and plane accidents. If you like true crime, I think you will enjoy the stories on that podcast too. And if you have people in your life that are firefighters, police officers, first responders, or retired from any of those professions, I believe they would like the stories on my podcast, All Available Units Respond. So far, there are 4 episodes on there. In fact, stick around because I'm going to put a preview of my other podcast at the end of this recording. Thank you again for being here. I truly, truly appreciate each and every one of you. Tune in next week for episode 14 when I'll tell you another true crime story. Big hugs to all of you. Bye-bye. Do not be alarmed. The emergency tones and sirens you are about to hear are not real. Investigators know from video taken that night that the first flames started just seconds into Great White's opening song. 11 seconds after ignition, the band noticed the flames. People in the crowd noticed the flames too and began to realize that they were not an intentional part of the show. 25 seconds after the first flames appeared on the upper left wall, flames were touching the ceiling on both sides of the platform stage. The band stopped playing 30 seconds after the fire began. According to the NIST report, quote, the fire spread very quickly across the polyurethane foam, end quote. The fire soared across the walls and ceiling. Most of the crowd began to evacuate. 41 seconds after ignition, the fire alarm began to sound and the emergency strobe lights started to flash. According to a surviving witness, Linda Saran, inside the club that night, quote, the foam was raining down and the flames are dripping from the ceiling. It looked like it was raining black fire, end quote. She also said, quote, the bar got quiet because people were dying, literally, and all you could hear was the roar of the fire and liquor bottles exploding, end quote. Linda and her friend Deb knew they were quickly running out of time to get out. They went to a window and kicked at it, but it wouldn't break. An off-duty police officer that had been outside the window had heard the kicking at the window. He went to get a tire iron from his car, busted the glass, and started pulling people outside through the broken window. When Linda finally made it outside, she realized she was burned badly. Her hands wouldn't work. Then she noticed the black on her arms. She described her burned arms like this, quote, "It looked like a ladder of those black jelly bracelets from the 80s hanging in rings around my wrist," end quote. Another survivor of the fire, Phil Barr, was between the stage and the front door, crouching down behind some people in front of him. He said, quote, "You could not see your hand in front of your face. That's how thick the smoke was. Once you could no longer see, it was total pandemonium," end quote. People were trying to push to the front door. Phil had gotten to the club early in the evening that night, well before the club became crowded. Therefore, he'd had time to wander around and get acclimated to the layout of the club. He said, quote, "It became really clear that we were not going to be able to get out the front door," end quote. He knew there was another exit in the main bar room. It was further, but it was a straight shot to get to it. He went around the crowd of people trying to get to the front exit and into the main bar room. He was getting pushed from behind, and he tripped over what he'd assumed was a bar stool. He fell flat on his face. He explained that it became very difficult to breathe. He passed out. He could no longer hear alarms, noise, or screaming. He said when he came to, he felt burning on his face and excruciating pain near the base of his spine. He felt a weight on top of him. He said he was pretty certain he'd crawled out from under another person in order to get up. He ran across the room and ran face first into the wall. He ended up feeling the door and rammed his shoulder into it. He fell out of the exit door and down the stairs. He could barely breathe. His chest felt tight and constricted, and his throat was bleeding. Phil Barr was placed in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks. When he awoke, he was told that his lungs had been badly damaged. He spent 1 month in the hospital, fighting to breathe on his own, and had to learn to walk again. At 50 seconds after ignition of the fire, the ceiling above the alcove was fully involved in fire. At 11:09 p.m., less than 1 minute after the fire started, 911 received 3 cell phone calls from people on scene at the station. The information was immediately relayed to the West Warwick Fire Department, who assigned and dispatched Engine 4, Engine 1, Engine 2, Ladder 1, Rescue 1, and Battalion Chief 1 to the fire scene. At 1 minute after ignition, thick, black smoke came out of the sunroom windows. The smoke appeared to be at floor level inside these windows at this time. Occupants were escaping out of these windows. At 60 seconds after ignition, flashover occurred. According to the U.S. Fire Administration, quote, "Flashover is a thermally driven event during which every combustible surface exposed to thermal radiation in a compartment or enclosed space rapidly and simultaneously ignites," end quote. At 90 seconds from ignition, visibility in the club is lost due to heavy smoke filling. People were piled up in the front entrance, jamming the doorway. Survivors who'd escaped were trying to rescue people who were wedged in the front doorway. Smoke poured out over the top of the pile of trapped people.